Take your Bibles if you would like today. I've got Genesis 22. We're actually not going to be there quite a bit. We are going to be somewhat topical this morning, a bit more of an academic message today. We've had a few different types of messages lately. We had our general overview kind of history sort of message, and then before that we had a foundational theology message, and we're back in theology today, thinking through a concept that we kind of need to lay the foundation for in order then to understand what we're seeing here in Genesis 22 all the more. This week, next week, a little bit more academic, a little bit more lecture-y of a sort. Not that I'm lecturing you, but that I'm lecturing about a topic of theology. But that's going to give way to us having a fullness of understanding related to why it is that Genesis 22, we would count it to be so important, why it is that the Gospels and the epistles count Genesis 22 to be so important. So last time we were together, we completed that survey of the narrative surrounding Abraham and Isaac's act of faith in yielding their will to the will of the Lord in obedience to his word. And that was our application. Is it all on the altar? What isn't on the altar? What has fallen short in your life of being on the altar? And we kind of thought through that very practical application of the narrative itself from Genesis 22, but there's several more things. We need to talk about that picture of salvation that we find there. We need to talk about the idea in James chapter 2 that faith without works is dead, being alone. But in order to do that, I need you to understand a couple more things from the deeper level of biblical interpretation. And the first one of those that we need to understand is typology. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll talk about the nature of justification, faith, and works. The fullness of the prophetic picture of the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ. But before either of those, we address over these next 2 weeks, first, the biblical concept of type and antitype. And then, the week after that, next week, we'll build upon it the theological significance of of Isaac being called Abraham's only son, when, of course, we know he's not his only son. And so we begin today with this idea of typology, a type-antitype relationship in the Bible. These words type and antitype are actually derived from the Greek words from which we see them in the scriptures, the word tupos and then the word antitupos. Tupos, a type, being a print or a form or an example, and then the antitupos, or the antitype, being a thing formed after that pattern. In English, the prefix anti typically denotes that which is opposite, opposed to something. We actually have the idea of anti being a negative today, that you see something, and if you are anti that thing, you are opposed to that thing, say, ideologically. The idea of the anti-fascist movement today, in theory, though they're a little bit confused, they say that they are against fascism, therefore they call themselves an anti-fascist, in opposition to. But that is actually a fairly narrow application of what the word means. In English, we have something called an antechamber, and that would be a chamber that is on the opposite side of another one. It's simply across the room. We also have the idea in our Bibles of Antichrist, seen in 1 John, and only in 1 John. But the idea of Antichrist, we often think of it as the guy who hates Christ, which absolutely is the case. But the word anti actually gives us a much broader concept there of that which is opposite in the pattern of, but opposed to. So when we see Antichrist come, kind of as I preached a few weeks ago in that burden sermon on the nature of the times in which we live, we might not expect him initially to be that man who seems utterly opposed to the things of Christ. Significantly more, he might come in a pattern of claiming to be a messianic figure. Right? We would expect that. It's not until, of course, that midway point that we would expect then the blasphemies against the Most High God to become virulent against him. So in Greek, the prefix denotes a contrast as well, but less so does it demand any sort of opposition other than positionally. So that when we think of the idea of a type and an antitype, we're not talking about a type and then the thing that opposes the type, as in is against it, but rather a type and then something which is opposite to that type in a metaphorical way, but then actually has a pattern of the original type. So the antitype is patterned after the type, or is the end goal of the pictured type. And we'll give examples here in a minute to help you understand the idea. So the formal definition of a typology, as we would state it, would be that it is the study of Old Testament people, things, or events, those would be the types, which divinely foreshadow New Testament concepts and ideas. Those would be the antitypes. And mostly these are related to the person and work of Jesus Christ, the gospel and the work of Jesus Christ. This is the type-antitype relationship within the Bible. Old Testament people, things, or events which divinely foreshadow New Testament truths, particularly regarding Jesus Christ, his person, his character, his work. And we find that the apostles delineate this through a sort of relationship through Old Testament figures and New Testament realities that is truly worth our notice. Now, before we dig into the biblical examples of this, I want to lay down a few principles. When we're looking for type-antitype relationships, there's multiple ways that people will look for this. And this is something which I'm going to lay down a way of interpreting the scriptures as it relates to type-antitypes. You're certainly not going to find this universal in all interpretation methods. Throughout the Old Testament, we find historical accounts that reflect New Testament truths. We find people, we find events that bear a measure of similarity to the things that we experience in our own spiritual lives. A good example of this is David and Goliath. Now, if I were preaching, or if any preacher gets up and he preaches the passage of David and Goliath, we are reading a historical narrative, an amazing tale of a young man who is blessed by God to slay a mighty enemy who in himself could not have been slain. A mighty man who without sword or shield, but only with a sling, trusting the Lord and the promises that the Lord had given, goes out before a seasoned warrior and slays that warrior in the name of the Lord and wins a great victory for Israel on that day. Now that is the biblical narrative. But if you've ever heard David and Goliath preached, that's probably not what you're carrying away. What you're carrying away is the idea that we have giants in our own lives, right? That's what you'll often hear. We have giants in our own lives, and that if we'll trust the Lord and we'll face those giants in the name of the Lord, according to his promises, that by trusting in him, we will slay those giants that we face in our life by faith. And that is a fine application. By nature, it's a good application, it's fine. A biblical truth drawn from a godly example. But what it isn't is a divinely designed allegory. It is not a situation directly intended by God to be a representation in our lives of a deeper spiritual truth. It's a narrative which contains potential applications for our lives, but it isn't a type. It isn't a divinely designed narrative directly intended to bring about a New Testament concept in our lives, and particularly about Jesus Christ himself. It isn't a situation that God divinely designed as a direct spiritual message to enliven the reality of Jesus Christ and the gospel in the ears of the hearers. Now again, there are plenty of pastors who would disagree with me in this. They see types and pictures as in a vast number of Old Testament passages. They broaden it to basically any similarity is a type, and it has a direct New Testament reality, so that every single thing that we see in the Old Testament is intended to picture the church in some way, shape, or form. Oftentimes that view kind of goes along with replacement theology because they see the church as having replaced Israel. And so there are plenty of pastors who would teach it that way. They in fact see the whole Old Testament narrative, especially the events surrounding the Exodus, as completely metaphorical of the spiritual realities of life under grace. But I disagree with that. And I think when we see everything as a metaphor, we kind of talked about this in Sunday school this morning. If everything becomes a metaphor, then the metaphors that God explicitly designed for us to see get lost in the shuffle of all of the other things that we're calling metaphors. And so I think we should be careful of that. I think that's not a good thing. Instead, I believe the text warrants the idea of making careful separation between those elements of a narrative which we can find true reason to believe are designed by God to further our understanding of spiritual truths under grace. And to separate that from those things in the narrative which are very useful for application, but are perhaps not authoritative in our lives as a actual direct picture. Genesis 22 is perhaps a good example. We see a type-antitype relationship. If we weren't, I wouldn't be talking about typology today. But the application that we made last week is you're all on the altar. Have you laid everything on the altar? This is not a type-antitype relationship. God is not asking us necessarily to take our things and sacrifice them physically or anything of the sort. What we are looking at there is it was drawing out an application from the example of Abraham himself. And so finally, let me give you a effectively fivefold, we might say a sixfold standard, not original to me, that gives us kind of the boundaries that I use when I'm working through is something a type or an antitype within our Bibles. And this is not original to me. It is from the book Basic Bible Interpretation by Roy Zuck. And that's a book that's certainly worth your time reading. But I'm going to give you those principles today, the principles of determining a type-antitype relationship in the Bible. And the first of these principles, an obvious resemblance between the Old Testament type and the New Testament antitype. I'm not just going to draw something out of thin air, right? I'm not going to say that the Ark of the Covenant is a picture of the Lord's table just because the Ark of the Covenant had a mercy seat on it or something, and I'm going to try to just work through that in my own mind and draw some strained connection, hiding the remainder of the things that don't fit in order to make some connection, because we have to find some connection between some Old Testament element and some New Testament. No, when we're looking at a type-antitype relationship, if you know your Bible, as you're reading that Old Testament type, as you're reading that Old Testament example, what is coming to your mind is that New Testament parallel that you've seen before. It feels familiar, it looks familiar. There's a spiritual connection that is made between these ideas. Second, a type has a true historical purpose and context. The Old Testament type will have been a real person, place, or thing. It's not made-up mythology intended only to teach a lesson or a parable or an allegory, but history that God weaved and designed together to prophetically teach a future lesson, not to the generation that lived it, but to our generation who look back upon it through the lens of Jesus Christ, his finished work, and of grace. So first, the type and antitype relationship share a genuine and substantive resemblance. Second, the type-antitype relationship, the type has a true historical purpose and context. Number three, and this is, if you haven't written those down yet, we'll get back to a slide that has all of them on it, but for the sake of room and readability, I'm going to be knocking a few of those points off. Number three, the type must have a predictive element to it. Known or unknown in focus, there is a predictive element, something about it that reflects a prophetic foreshadowing of that which is to come. Maybe the people of the day recognized it to be so. Maybe they did not recognize it to be so, but there's a prophetic foreshadowing. Fourth, the antitype has a greater and superior spiritual purpose than the type which it foreshadows. So this is that idea of it being opposite, of it kind of fulfilling a prophetic element that the type laid in place. The New Testament antitype will be greater in spiritual purpose. It will look to the understanding eye like a sort of fulfillment of the Old Testament purpose and place or thing, which, though it stood on its own in its own day, is now realized in a new way as we see it through the New Testament lens. And then, sort of finally, this is the final technical one, and then we'll add one more bonus. But there is evidence that the type-antitype relationship is divinely intended. And this is the one that's going to be most useful to us, coupled with number 6, which is when the Bible gives us evidence that says this is intended to tell you something, to teach you something, that's a really helpful clue. And we'll look at a couple of those this morning. The rest we're going to look at in Sunday school next Sunday. So if you want to dig a little deeper into this relationship, come to Sunday school next week. We're going to talk through significantly more passages that show this type-antitype relationship as a little bit of a break between lessons there in our Sunday school hour. So within this more limited scope of type-antitype relationships, which we define as being more refined and more intentional than simply applications or illustrations, we look for evidence of intent by God, as if the way that he went about weaving history together reflected an intentional effort by God to teach us something by the way that he brought it to pass. The way that God instructed Moses to build the ark. The way that God instructed the nation to carry out the Passover. The way that God instructed Moses to deliver the nation through the brazen serpent. There's these strange things, like why did God have Moses put a serpent of brass on a standard and erect that standard? So that people, when they look upon it, they would live. And we don't really know until John 3, when Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life. And so we find in that moment the reality of that spiritual connection that they didn't necessarily know in that day, other than if you're reading through your Bible and you understand grace and you're reading that account of looking and living, you would say, wow, that feels familiar. The idea that I'm dying of something and I can't do anything about it. But then if I will look at the thing that God has called me to look at by faith, trusting in it, there's a familiarity there. And then the New Testament takes that familiarity and kind of welds it into what Jesus is teaching about the gospel, and it makes it something more. Type-anti-type relationship. And then finally, number 6. The relationship is designated in the scriptures through the Greek words tupos and antitupos, which we do see from time to time. When we see those words, that's very helpful because that gives us a insight that we're looking at something that follows this pattern. And so for the remainder of our time today, what I'd like to do is show you a couple of instances where we see this word and give you examples of this and what it looks like. The passages that bear the marks of this relationship, how they work, and then finally we'll bring it back to Genesis 22, and of course we will draw it into an application. It's no good being here if all we're doing is learning knowledge. We'll draw it into a spiritual application before we're finished. So we're going to begin in Romans chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, you could turn there to verse 12 in Romans 5. And of course it will be up on the screen as is typical. But in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, the Bible says this: Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them, that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. So here in Romans chapter 5, Paul is speaking about Adam and the man by whom, as being the man by whom sin entered the world, and death by sin. So that death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. We call that the doctrine of original sin. And again, there's debates as to what that looks like. There's several different theological terms that cover exactly how it is that Adam's sin passes down from generation to generation. But the basic idea presented here is that Adam served as a representative for the whole human race. And when he sinned, and thus death by sin, he was separated from God. This death was inherited by all of Adam's descendants, so that every man who has ever lived, with the notable exception of Jesus Christ, who was born of a human mother, but was conceived of the Holy Ghost, and so did not have a human father, is born into sin and has inherited the death that sin has engendered. And as Paul describes this sinful standing of man due to the sin of Adam, he says that Adam is the figure, and that word is our word type, of him that was to come. Continuing to explain who Adam was a type for in verse 15. He says, but not as the offense, so also is the free gift. For if through the offense of one many be dead, that would be Adam, many be dead, right? Much more the grace of God and the gift of grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. What was lost in Adam was recovered in Jesus Christ. By the offense of one, sin came into the world, and death by sin. Now by the obedience of one, the grace of God may rest upon men, and the gift of salvation by grace through faith. Thus Adam is a type of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the antitype. His work in bringing men back to reconciliation with God is the antitype to Adam's failure in separating men from God. Jesus being the antitype, Adam being the type. Adam, of course, a historical figure, actually lived, whose life and actions were relevant in his own time, who actually faced the things that the Bible says he faced, whose life and actions also serve as a direct picture of the future spiritual truths surrounding Jesus Christ and the gospel of grace. And as we run down our general framework, I made those different colors to try to differentiate between the different points there. Hopefully those are readable enough for you, those 6 points. As we run down our general framework for identifying these relationships, we find that Adam and Jesus, his work on the cross, fit this bill. Adam's choice to sin forms a type which is inversely reflected in Jesus' choice to obey. Hence, Jesus being called the second Adam, or the last Adam. Adam's choice leading to the whole of humanity being brought into sin and death. Jesus' choice leading all who would receive it back out of sin and death and into life. Now, the next time we see this word type used relevantly then is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I'm going to read a bit more of this passage for context, so follow with me. If you have your Bibles, you can certainly turn there. Again, it will be on the screen. 1 Corinthians 10, we will begin in verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, there's our word, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, that's our same word, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So Paul enters this section of Corinthians with a lesson, with many lessons, a lesson drawn from many accounts in Exodus and Numbers. He speaks of all of our fathers. Paul, of course, was a Jew, and it's evident that he considered his readership to have many Jews among them. And he says that they were under the cloud and passed through the sea and were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and the sea, and all did eat that same spiritual meat. So Paul speaks of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea here, which he calls the baptism unto Moses. Now, when we think of baptism, we think of two different things, right? We think of the spiritual baptism that takes place when the Holy Spirit of God indwells us and he breaks the chains of sin in our lives. And then we think of the outward picture of baptism, the biblical ordinance commanded by our Savior, exemplified throughout the New Testament, whereby a person makes a volitional choice to associate himself with a new and a different manner of thinking and living, and he publicly announces that by being immersed underwater. And as he's immersed in water, that is a picture of him being dead and buried, and then as he's brought back out of the water, that's a picture of him coming out of that grave and being raised to walk in newness of life. That's what Romans 6 says. Buried with him by baptism into death, raised to walk in newness of life. It is for this reason that we don't do the sprinkling or the pouring or any of those things, because not only is that not anywhere seen or commanded in the Word of God, but it actually physically undermines the picture of what baptism is supposed to be, because baptism is a picture of the burial, of being buried and then being resurrected, of going into the ground and being covered by dirt and then being brought back out. So sprinkling and pouring simply don't fit that picture in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's what we think of. But in this case, Paul says that the nation was baptized unto Moses when the nation passed through the Red Sea. Now, if you remember anything about the Red Sea, it's kind of important to that whole narrative that they didn't get wet. Like the whole point of that is that they didn't get wet, right? Not only did they not go through the water, like they didn't swim, but they walked across it on dry ground. God immediately dried up the land so that even their feet didn't get wet after parting that water. So it's interesting that baptism is the word being used here. And by the way, Peter will speak of baptism, the baptism that happened when Noah entered the ark as well. Another story where it's notable, the whole point was they didn't get wet, right? So we have two times where there's this spiritual idea of baptism spoken of based upon Old Testament analogies, and both times water is involved, and both times the person doesn't get wet. Now, that does not mean that baptism is supposed to be you looking at the water and not getting wet in the ordinance sense, but the idea here is that there's something more to baptism, right? This word baptism. When the nation passed through the Red Sea, this was a baptism. What does that mean? That was the moment of public expression of devotion and association with Moses as God's prophet. See, to this point, the crossing of the Red Sea, at that point, that was the moment of decision. It was easy enough for that mixed multitude. The Passover had just happened. The firstborn in every household had died if they did not have the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. People are confused. Their firstborn children dead all throughout Egypt. Everybody just wants Israel to go away. They throw all of the money at them, right? They throw at them their jewelry and everything. And they say, just get out of this land. And it would be easy enough, and the Bible says a mixed multitude went. Lots of Egyptians went with them. It was easy enough to get there and to get to the Red Sea. And now they're there. They're trapped. Pharaoh is coming behind them. The sea is in front of them. And they say, God just brought us out in the wilderness to have us slain here. Then God commands Moses, and Moses lifts up his arms, and the Red Sea parts, and the Lord parts that sea. Now you have a decision to make. You're going to be walking through walls of water. Are you willing to take that walk? Is the sea just going to collapse on top of you like it would to Pharaoh in the next day? Or would you pass through safely? That was the moment of decision. That was the public exercising of profession of faith in Moses as the prophet and what God was doing, the deliverance. The declaration that old things are passed away and all things are become new. That was the moment. Every single person who passed through that Red Sea left Egypt. That was the moment they left Egypt. To that point, they had left the direct locale of Egypt, but it was not until they passed through the Red Sea that they had left Egypt behind. And that's that picture. The official leaving of Egypt. And notice as Paul continues to describe these events, he says in verse 4, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So once we get to verse 4, it is evident that Paul sees more in the events of Exodus than simple history. He sees in them a spiritual baptism in the Red Sea. He sees spiritual nourishment from the rock. And he says that rock was Christ. And then Paul goes on to give a warning. Because though all the fathers passed through the sea, they all ate the manna, they all drank from the rock, they all partook of those things, many were yet overthrown in the wilderness through their lusting after the land from which they had come. Lusting after Egypt, and many were overthrown. And then Paul says, based upon this example, flee fornication, idolatry, murmuring, tempting Christ. And 2 times in the passage, Paul says these things are an example, and that word is tupos, type for us. So we read in verse 11, all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. These things are a type, specifically to express to us the danger of sin. So that as we put it all together, and we'll do a lot more of this in Sunday school for those of you that are interested, we see that Egypt is truly the picture in the Bible of the unbeliever. The Red Sea is that picture of salvation. The wandering in the wilderness is those points of decision. The promised land is not heaven. In most of the songs that we sing, the heaven is pictured as the promised land. But that's not an accurate picture. The promised land is not going to be a place where there's still giants and there's still walls and we have to fight our way through it and whatnot. The promised land of Canaan is the picture of victorious Christian living, and I think Hebrews makes this very clear. If you've not heard my Hebrew series, I encourage you to listen to it. There we lay out pretty clearly those things. Notice, however, that when Paul talks about those being overthrown in the wilderness because they longed for the things of Egypt, because they longed for those things, because they lusted after evil things, they did not actually go back to Egypt, did they? There's no picture here of losing one's salvation, of falling away and ending up back in Egypt. They went through the Red Sea, they drank of the spiritual drink, they ate of the spiritual meat, yet in that place of temptation, they were overthrown and they became ineffective. And they were not able to get to the promised land because the entire generation was overthrown in the wilderness. They never made it to that place of victorious Christian living. And that's the warning that Paul gives here. Be careful that you're not going to be one of those Christians who spends your entire life lusting after all of the things that you don't have because you're in Christ and not going back into an unregenerate state. You can't do that. You have been made a new creature. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. All things are become new. Something that is born cannot become unborn. It can die, but it can't become unborn. A new creation cannot be unmade. It can be killed, but it cannot be unmade. So you're not going back to Egypt, but you can be overthrown. You can become ineffective. You can become a spiritually impotent as a follower of Christ. And Paul says that when you do so, you fall short. So don't do that. These things are there as our example. They are an admonition for us upon whom the ends of the worlds are come, that we would not lust after evil things. So we should take heed lest we fall. Paul draws several links between the historical narratives of Exodus and the teachings of Jesus Christ. He invokes the word baptism in regard to the Red Sea. He talks about manna as spiritual meat, the rock from which they drank as Christ as spiritual drink. And when we pass all of these verbal cues through our generalized framework of identifying type, antitype relationships, we find that all of the elements are well represented. All of these things happened in history. They stand in their own right as important events in the life of the nation of Israel itself. They are not just metaphors. They are not mythology. They are not fun stories that we tell. This is history. But God wove that history together. God led Israel out of Egypt to the Red Sea, specifically so that he could bring them through the Red Sea, specifically so that he could then give them that manna, give them out of that rock. Moses striking the rock the first time, supposed to speak to it the second time because the rock never gets struck again. Jesus Christ is once struck. We don't have to strike him again to get any more out of him. He is struck once, and then after that we speak to him, and the rivers of blessing flow. All of that was put together specifically to teach us something of Jesus Christ's life, ministry, and grace. A type, anti-type relationship. The manner that God dictated these events bear tremendous markers of prophetic spiritual purpose. Passing through the Red Sea, indicative of the moment of salvation. Old things being passed away, all things become new. Provision in the wilderness, manna and water, indicative of the time in the believer's life when they're being tempted and being tried, where you're walking one day at a time, where you're following the fire and you're following the cloud, and you're not really at rest. And in these days, some are overthrown. And they don't end up back in Egypt. They don't lose their salvation and end up back in the slavery of sin. But they do rest in spiritual ineffectiveness because they loved the things of Egypt more than the things of God. So we can comfortably believe that the way God wove this history together teaches us these lessons specifically. Type, anti-type relationship. Now, time fails me to walk through all of the rest of the examples, but as I said, Sunday school next Sunday, we'll spend time walking through other examples. I encourage you this week, if you're going to be there, look through the scriptures. If you have questions, Pastor, is this one? Would you consider it a type, anti-type? Whenever we systematize the Word of God and we label things, there is no right or wrong. Pastor, is this a type, anti-type relationship? We made up this relationship. We did it to systematize the Bible. I can tell you what I think, but all we're doing there is we're drawing out and systematizing things that are in the Word of God. However, it helps us as we're studying a passage like Genesis 22, And so for the remainder of our time, that's where we spend it. In Genesis 22, verse 2, God said to Abraham, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." Our historical narrative began with an important statement which reveals that there's likely more going on here than meets the eye. First, because God calls Isaac Abraham's only son. He's not his only son. You say, why is that? We need to dig a little bit. But it's sufficient for us to know two things today, and we'll talk about that next week, as I said. Biologically, Isaac is not Abraham's only son. That's not what God is talking about. Second, Jesus came to earth and claimed the title as the only begotten Son of God, immediately creating in our mind a link between the events of Genesis 22 and those of Jesus Christ. Now, the next point of importance is verse 8. Isaac notices that the wood and the knife and the fire, they're all there, but there's no lamb. Isaac questions his father on this, asking why there is no lamb, and Abraham responds, verse 8, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Recall in Hebrews 11, we know Abraham expected to slay his son and that God would raise him from the dead. Abraham's response here is ambiguous but also confident. God will provide a lamb. So Abraham binds his son, lays him on the wood, and at that moment the angel of the Lord stays Abraham's hand, of which we read in verse 12. Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. So God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, but Abraham's faith now has been justified. Isaac's faith likewise. Abraham has not withheld his only son. And then we read in verse 13, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. So God then provides a ram, which Abraham takes and burns as a burnt offering in the stead of his son. Now there's some interesting things here. And as we put it all together, in this account we find true resemblances. A man yielding his only son. A son, likely full of age, being able to resist, trusting his father and yielding to his father's will in this sacrifice. But a sacrifice which was not asked on that day, for in that day the man got to keep his son and another was slain in its place. And in this we might see relationships that are worth digging. Not between any of the figures singularly, not between the circumstances singularly, whereby the Heavenly Father willingly yielded his only son in love for the world, whereby the Lord himself provided a lamb to be offered up in our stead. We see that. But we don't see it one-to-one. We see various aspects, right? We see the atonement. There's a ram. And that ram is given for the son. So we see that the son does not die, whereas we know the father did cause his son to die. And yet then we connect that to Hebrews, where Paul tells us that Abraham anticipated that his son was going to die and raise from the dead. All of this brings us to say, is there something more happening here? And as we look down that list, we'd say, yes, there is. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's going to be the foundation for me to be able to stand up here and confidently preach in 2 weeks the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ through the picture of Genesis 22. It's not just going to be a passing resemblance. It's not going to be your pastor creatively finding a way to work Jesus' sacrifice into this passage. We see links here that give confidence to me as a teacher, to you as a studier, that God intended something here that is worthy of our notice. And we'll draw that notice out. And that's the application that I actually want to draw from this process of study that we did today. A couple of weeks ago in our Sunday afternoon session, we considered together the various elements of end times interpretation. We were finishing up that series. And we had a valuable discussion about how we interpret the Bible. We had a good discussion about the value and the limitations of Old Testament narratives. And what we said was that all of the Bible is written for us, but not all of the Bible is written to us. There are promises in the Bible which are not for me. Promises given, but they're not mine. They're made to different people. They're conditioned upon different conditions. Every promise in the book is not mine. And thank God for that. I'm not the target of covenantal promises of scattering and regathering. I'm not the target of commands to be stoned if I don't do something right. These things are not written to me. But that doesn't mean that they aren't written for me. And that's the philosophy that I encourage you to think about today, that we carry with us as we go. Today we read in 1 Corinthians 10 of the value of the Exodus in our lives. There's certainly a historical value to understanding what God did in those days and understanding his character and how that's reflected in our lives. But as a typological picture of the reality of salvation, trial, testing, and rest, the warnings in those days that carry over to today, that we would not lust after evil things, to take heed, lest thinking I stand, I end up falling. And again, in our time in Sunday school, we will consider more of those type-antitype relationships together, fully substantiating what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And to this I encourage you, Christian, don't neglect the Old Testament in your Bible. In it you will not find the nitty-gritty of grace-filled doctrine. Those things are realized in our lives most abundantly through the epistles, the teachings of the apostles. Not even really through the Gospels, mostly through the epistles. But the God of that grace-filled doctrine that we are taught in the epistles is not a different God from the God of the Gospels or the God of the Old Testament. Not different in character, not different in purpose, only different in operation. And that not because of us in any way, shape, or form, but only because Jesus Christ fulfilled in his life and his death and his resurrection the justice and righteousness which his holy character has always demanded, thus freeing him to operate in the fullness of grace unto which his character has always been predisposed. So much so that if you recall from our Hebrew study, if you recall from that little mention in Galatians, we believe that God even delegated the giving of the law at the hand of an angel so that he could be semi-separated from the giving of the law because it was slightly outside of his nature, because the law was not there to actually redeem mankind. The law was there to show mankind he was lost. To this end, then, understanding how often the apostles appeal to the character of God as reflected in the Old Testament to establish the realities of Christian living. And we'll consider those next week in Sunday school. Romans 4, Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 10, 2 Peter 1, all of Hebrews. All of these teachings connecting our lives to the reality of the character and the heart of God, drawn from Old Testament interactions. Christian, don't neglect the Old Testament. Those things that were written aforetime were written for your learning, written so that you might, through patience, through comfort of the Scriptures, have hope. Live in the expectation of the character of God who does not change. See in the lives of that great cloud of witnesses the opportunity at times to learn, to follow or not follow their example, to learn from their failures. In all these things, however, understanding the character of God better, because he's the same God yesterday, today, forever. And why? Well, today we had a bit of a knowledge sermon, right? I gave you a lot of knowledge today. I gave you a little bit, I pulled back the curtain a little bit on interpretation and study and theology and such. But why do we have understanding? Why do we seek understanding? Understanding is not an end unto itself, Christian. Understanding exists so that you might serve better, so that you might love better, so that you might obey better. Knowledge without application is empty. It's Gnosticism. It's us standing in our ivory tower, looking down at everyone that does not know what we know. That's not what knowledge is for. Knowledge is intended to draw us into Christ so that then we might foster in ourselves through him the character of Christ so that we might serve properly. Because as Proverbs 9 verse 10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. And so, Christian, as we seek to live into that knowledge, to work it into our lives, wisdom, so that we might then serve and we might then obey, let us allow those examples in the Old Testament, those types and antitypes, those applications to dwell in us richly. Let us not see it as just a vestige of a different time and a different way that God worked. Let us see the power of those examples, the reflection of the character of God within them, in our own lives, so that we might live into the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. Thank you for listening to a weekly sermon of Legacy Baptist Church in Independence, Minnesota. While online sermons are not an adequate substitute for a local church in the life of a believer, we hope that its contents has served to assist and encourage you in your walk with the Lord. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.